In most cases today, you who are here are either familiar with or know maybe even very thoroughly the story of David and Goliath. And for the most part, those who have just heard of that story at least are aware that it is about a young man who kills a much larger adversary with a stone and a sling. But what some of you know, but many of you may not, is the rest of the story. David was in that valley facing that giant as the culmination of an event that had been taking place for days and even weeks prior. Let me explain. The Israelites, when David was a young boy, and Saul was their first king, David actually used to, even prior to the David and Goliath event, used to show up and play his harp for Saul, King Saul, who had these emotional issues to the degree that it almost drove him mad, and David's harp was the only thing that could soothe King Saul's emotional breakdowns. And so David was in the picture before David and Goliath, but Saul and his nation had one particular group of people that caused them a lot of trouble, and it was the Philistines of the Old Testament era. Those Philistines, which were down southwest of Israel along the Mediterranean Sea, inhabited a geographical area that today is known as the Gaza Strip. And so, ironically, that piece of geography is still contested in Israel, only now it's inhabited by the Palestinians. But in that day, the Philistines gave the Israelites quite a bit of trouble. And on that particular day, that fateful day where David would show up at the valley of Elah, the valley of Elah was inhabited at that precise moment by an enormous man of about 9 feet tall named Goliath. And on one side of that valley at the top was the army of the Israelites. And on the other side of the valley, let's just say this group of pews to my left, your right, might be the army of the Israelites. And let's just say this group of pews to my right, your left, might be the army of the Philistines. You say, oh, Pastor Johnny, they don't want to be the army of the Philistines. That's okay, because the middle, you're the valley. And let's just say that the army of the Philistines, or the army of the Israelites and the army of the Philistines were facing one another, and Goliath was down in the valley calling out the Israelites. One of the reasons he was doing that was in that day, it was not at all uncommon for armies to take out their champion, their MVP, if you will. And to have their army's MVP go to battle one-on-one with the other army's MVP, and whoever won the battle, the losing foe, they would fight to the death, by the way. You say, well, that's terrible. I guess it's better that one die than hundreds die, right, in a battle. That losing foe, his army, would become slaves to the winner. And so Goliath would stand down in the valley and call out the Israelites. He'd call them names. He'd call their mama's names. He'd call their daddy's names. He would call their pet dog names. If they had a dog down the valley, he would kick the dog. And then he would say bad things about their God. And every morning, according to the Scriptures, the Israelites would wake up and they would issue the war cry. I don't know what that sounds like. But let's just suppose they would wake up every morning and, the war cry, whatever that sounded like. There was only one problem. They would issue the war cry day after day, but at no point would they ever actually take action to go to war. How many of you know that if you threaten something long enough and don't do it, it becomes no longer a threat, it just becomes noise? That is one of the challenges of parenting, by the way. Never threaten something you can't back up. Because if you threaten it and you don't do it, then you just lost it right there. That's another message for another time. But if you threaten something over and over and you don't do it, it becomes pointless. And so the Israelites would threaten with the war cry day after day, never going to war, never sending a champion out. No one wanted to fight Goliath. And David showed up at the battlefield simply to bring his older brothers, who were warriors, bring them food, bread and cheese to be exact. And when he showed up there, he found out what was going on. He offered to fight Goliath. Saul said, "There's no way. He's gigantor, and you're just a little squeaky boy." And David said, "Well, here's the thing. When I was out with my sheep, I fought a bear and I fought a lion, and I beat them both, so I'm pretty sure I can take Goliath." Which always reminds me that in God's eyes, a bear is a lion is a Goliath. There's really not a whole lot of difference. It's all the same to God. And so David goes down into the valley, you know the story, takes the stone, pulls it out of his stone holder, his holster, puts it in the sling, hits Goliath upside the head, stone sinks in. It was like the one place that you could hit Goliath that wasn't covered that would kill him. I mean, it was kind of like Star Wars. You remember Star Wars at the end? How many of you have seen Star Wars, by the way? Okay. It's great because even a new generation, see a lot of youth raise their hand. That makes me feel good inside. Luke Skywalker comes in his X-Wing fighter, and he goes down, and they know that if they can get one shot down the garbage chute, it'll destroy the Death Star, right? And you've got like one shot, and the garbage chute's like 3 feet wide. And it's got to be a perfect shot. It's the one shot that would destroy the whole Death Star. Well, it was kind of like that with Goliath. When David slung the stone, there was one place, one shot, one time he could hit Goliath that would kill him. Otherwise, it was just going to make him mad. And so David hit Goliath where he needed to be hit. It killed him. And then David took Goliath's humongous sword and cut his head off, which he had promised to do. When that happened, something remarkable took place. A group of people behind David, who had been coming out day after day after day, issuing a war cry and going back to their tents and not fighting, all of a sudden, when they saw Goliath dead, Goliath's head cut off, they rushed out over the ledge, ran down through the valley, and chased the Philistines all the way to the river and destroyed them completely. I'm talking one young man kills one guy, and all of a sudden the whole army takes off, and they win the battle that day. How many of you know that sometimes it's amazing how much can happen when one person does one thing that motivates an entire group of people? It's amazing how much one person acting can cause an entire group of people to act when maybe they hadn't before. Giving can be just such a thing. Giving can be an encouragement or potentially a discouragement to other believers. This morning, I want to finish up a series in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 called Giving God's Way. And to do that, we're going to go to the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and we're going to consider the motivating power of generosity, how generosity can motivate others. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Now, I realize it's been several weeks since we've been in these chapters. And you may remember that the Apostle Paul is writing the Corinthians his second letter to them. Actually, it's his third letter, but we only have 2 of those 3 letters. So we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians were corrected, rebuked, and basically faced down by Paul. By 2 Corinthians, the Corinthian church had in most cases repented and turned and gotten right. And so Paul's writing them the letter to praise God for it. But when Paul had been in Corinth earlier, just a year earlier, he had challenged the Corinthians to give generously. And when he had been in Corinth earlier, The Corinthians had said they were going to give a large offering. This offering was to be given to Paul and his group to take to Jerusalem to help out a church that was in desperate need, that had been in famine and persecution and the whole deal. And so just over a year earlier, they had given their commitment to give this offering to send to Jerusalem, but it had never happened. And in between the time that Paul was in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians, till now 2 Corinthians, other churches had given generously, none the least of which was one of the poorest areas called Macedonia. And so Paul in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is writing back to Corinth, and at the end of his letter saying, now about the offering. I want you to know, he said in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he reminds them of what the Macedonians had done and the generosity they had offered in spite of the fact that they were poor. And he reminds the Corinthians that their church is not poor. They've got folks, they have resources, they have money, they have material things. And he reminds them that what they had committed to do before, he fully anticipates that they will follow through on. And as we've been looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and we've walked through it, we've learned some true principles about giving. I'm going to be quite honest with you. It's not about an amount. Well, how much should I give? It's not about an amount. It's not about me trying to preach and guilt you into giving. In fact, if I have to guilt you into giving, it's not even giving. If you give out of obligation, if I have to twist your arm, well, the fact is I'm not going to do that. But what we learn is giving in the New Testament church is all about the grace of God. And me saying, I see what God's done for me, and it's so overwhelming how much He's done for me, it's very easy for me then to turn around and give generously. And that's the principle of giving in the New Testament. And so as we come to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, in these first 5 verses, now this is not all. In fact, we'll not finish chapter 9 because next week I'm starting a very special series. I can't wait. Many of you have let me know that you're excited. You're looking forward to it. It's going to be a study through Genesis called In the Beginning. It'll start next Sunday. I can't wait. But nevertheless, we won't quite finish with chapter 9, but we will today finish with verses 1 through 5. And so let's begin in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, as we think about the motivating power of generosity. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready. Lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. Here, as Paul challenges the Corinthians to simply follow through on what they said they would do, you'll note he doesn't mention amounts. In fact, to tell you the truth, chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians are a perfect place for Paul to set some really clear amounts they're supposed to get. He never does that. What he does say is, your giving, let it be done joyfully, let it be done generously, and let it be done out of a heart that just overflows with gratitude to God. And I'll tell you this, if we're giving from that basis, there will be no problem with us down to the nitty-gritty trying to find out exactly what an amount we're to give. We'll give generously. There will be no issue with funds or resources in the church. But as we go to verses 1 through 5, I want to share with you 3 simple principles on giving that will encourage others. Giving that will encourage others. The first is this. Generous giving can motivate giving. Generous giving can motivate giving. Look at verse 1. Paul says, now concerning the ministering to the saints. The ministering he's speaking of is the offering he's taking back to Jerusalem. It's the offering he's taking back to the church in Jerusalem that was in desperate need. And most of the offerings he's collecting are at primarily Gentile churches. Not that there weren't Jews involved in those, but they were, for the most part, Gentile churches. And one of the things you'll see that Paul even mentions in other epistles is that the Gentile churches, in some ways, were in a debt to Jerusalem because that's where the church began among the Jewish people. And so he says about this ministering to the saints, they knew, and he uses a term, he says, it is superfluous for me to write to you. Superfluous, overkill, unnecessary. He wants to, I want to go ahead and establish this. I'm going to talk to you about the offering, but I know it's really not necessary for me to write to you about it. It's really not necessary for me to write to you about it because what we're going to find is Paul says, you've already committed and I know you're going to do what you said you're going to do. He's not using this as some kind of a reverse psychology, motivational technique. Paul knew his people. And one thing he knew about the Corinthians is when they were heading the direction they were supposed to head, they had no problem giving. I would dare say Corinth was probably traditionally a generous church. And so he says, first and foremost, let me tell you that I'm going to talk to you about it, but honestly, I really don't need to. Verse 2. For I know your willingness or your eagerness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians. Now watch this. A year earlier, we'll see, and here in verse 2, Paul even mentions a year earlier. He says, a year earlier, I was with you, and you made this large commitment to send to Jerusalem. And because of that large commitment, when I went into other churches, Macedonia in particular, I even boasted about you how generous your church was. Not by way of bragging or envy or trying to pit one or competition. It's not that at all. But Paul said, I actually boasted about you because I saw a real, genuine eagerness to give. Now understand something. Paul's not talking about some kind of a false pride that look at us, look at what we're giving. And if he sensed that, he would call it out, I promise you. But what he saw in the Corinthians was a genuine desire to give, so much so that when he went into Macedonia, he actually boasted about the Corinthians to them. Here in verse 2, it says, Achaia was ready a year ago. When he references Achaia, watch this. When he references Achaia, that is synonymous with Corinth. Achaia is the general region Corinth was in. So when you see Achaia, generally speaking, he's talking about Corinth and the church there. And he says, and your zeal, watch this. Zeo is the word here. It means to be hot. Your zeal. Zealot, this is a base word for zealot. Now look at this. The zeal of the Corinthians has done what? Look at verse 2. The zeal of the Corinthians did what? I'm asking you. It stirred up who? The majority. The majority of people were stirred up. In fact, this word stir is also used in Hebrews chapter 10 as it says, do not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. But meet all the more as the day approaches and spur one another on toward love and good deeds, or stir one another on toward love and good deeds. You think coming to church is about you? Coming to church is about you helping other people. And if you don't go to church because you think you're not getting anything out of it, then you're missing the whole point. Coming to church is about coming so we can encourage one another, so when we go back out, we're in a better place to serve Christ and to declare Him and to live Him out. Well, in the same way here, Paul says, look, the church in Corinth, your commitment was so large, your giving was so zealous, your desire to give was so obvious that it has actually stirred up a lot of other churches to give too. How about that? What is true for the church is true for the individual Christian in many ways. When we give generously, it can motivate generous giving. I've seen it happen over and over again. It's kind of like priming a water pump, and many of you don't even have any idea what I'm talking about. Some of you do. Way back in the day, when you got your water out of a pump, pumped up out of the ground, you could actually kind of pour water down in it that would kind of energize the pump, the water coming out, priming it, so that water would eventually flow. And once it was flowing, you're fine. It's priming the pump. It's using a little bit of water going down to prime the rest to come out. And in the same way, as believers, oftentimes, you may have one or two give who prime the pump of generosity. I wonder how many pumps the widow's mite has primed through the 2,000 years of the church. Her one little bitty, how could she possibly have known that day when she came to the temple and dropped her half a cent in the offering plate? How many people it would one day encourage to give and give generously? How could she have known? By the way, how could you possibly know what your generous giving might ultimately do? There is no way you could possibly know that any little offering, any generous offering you give on any day, what it could ultimately do to advance the kingdom, to encourage others. Generous giving can motivate giving. I'm convinced that as people give willingly and generously, there are others who may or may not have given otherwise step up and give. I say this, calling each of us, not only in material goods, but time and effort and talents and gifts, starting with myself, that we say, you know what? When I give generously, whatever my giving is, material things, financial resources, time, talents, efforts, there's no way for me to know how it might impact others to give. So I don't even need to concern myself with what it does, but I should know that it will, and it can motivate others. So generous giving can motivate giving. And then verses 3 and 4, watch this. Paul says, "Yet I have sent the brethren." Paul says, I'm sending some guys ahead. I'm sending some guys ahead, kind of my lead guys. "Lest our boasting of you should be vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready." I don't want to show up, and I'm going to have some of the Macedonians with me, because wherever Paul took an offering, he had some people from that church go with him as a matter of accountability. You say, well, why wouldn't they trust the Apostle Paul? It wasn't about trusting. They would have trusted Paul, but Paul was more concerned that they go with him to make sure that there were no questions that the money got exactly where it was supposed to be. So from church to church, Paul would go and collect the offering, and he would actually have somebody go with him from those churches or those areas as a matter of accountability. And so as he comes to Corinth or Achaia, as he comes to that church, he has some Macedonians with him. Well, guess what? He'd already told the Macedonians, man, you ought to see how eager the Corinthians were to give. You ought to see how eager they were to prepare and to give generously. He said, I don't want to show up there, and you've not even gotten the offering ready, and it's going to be embarrassing to you, and it's going to be embarrassing to me, and it'll just be an awkward situation. So he said, just in case, I sent some guys ahead to help you prepare the offering. I don't have any doubt that you want to do it. I just want to make sure that it's already ready when we arrive. Verse 4, "Lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting." Watch this. If generous giving can motivate giving, how many of you know that failure to follow through could possibly discourage giving? He said, I don't want to show up with these Macedonians who have poured their hearts out and heard about you, and they'd be disappointed and disillusioned. I don't think you mean to disillusion them. I don't think you mean to disappoint them. But that's what the end result would be. So I'm sending some guys ahead to prepare. It should be no surprise to any of us that if generous giving can encourage others to give, then lack can discourage. Proverbs says this, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So I guess the converse is true. As something dulls a knife's edge, so one man might dull another if we're not careful. Failure to follow through might actually discourage someone. Did you know that the godly walk of one person can actually affect the godly walk of another in a negative or a positive way? Up here, before the service began, or as the service began, we celebrated the Lord in baptism, right? And I thought about that last week as Miss Margie came forward and said, Pastor Johnny, I believe I'm supposed to follow forward in believer's baptism. She told me her story, and she said, I don't know all that it will do. And she shared some things with me about how she thought her obedience could possibly impact others. And she said, but I really don't know how it will impact them or if it will. We determined as we talked that she's not to be concerned about that. All she's to be concerned with is obedience. You can't ultimately determine how your obedience might positively or negatively impact another. All you can be concerned with is obedience. But I began to think about that because after the worship service that day, as she responded, then we had two other ladies that morning who came to me after church and said, I need to be baptized too. I saw Miss Margie come down, and it reminded me that I need to be baptized. Well, later that week, I had another one of our ladies come, the same thing, Miss Juanita. But guess what? I began to think farther back. Because when we got back Thursday night, late from Israel last week, the week before last, I should say, as we were driving in and coming in, I already had fully prepared this message to preach last week. Brother Tom Hall, our IT guy, already had the outline. He had the multimedia prepared. I had all my notes. I was all prepared to preach. And because of the jet lag, which kind of knocked us for a loop more than I think we anticipated, weren't fully prepared for how it kind of knocked us around, I was not prepared to shift gears. But as I came into my office Friday morning, it was beginning to impress on me so hard, can you really go to 2 Corinthians 9 without at least addressing what God did in your heart in Israel? And so I began to pray about it, and it didn't take long before the message, the devotion that is, it was a short 10-minute devotion, 10 or 11 minutes that I preached at the Jordan River. And I thought, that's really strange, Lord. I'm doing a series on giving, and then I'm about to go into a series through Genesis, and now I'm going to pop up with this message on baptism. What's that all about? It doesn't fit. But I was convinced that I was supposed to come back and share with you just an inkling of what God did in my heart, and how better to do that than share with you a message, an expanded message, albeit, of what I actually was able to share at the Jordan River. Well, I really didn't have time Friday or Saturday to really just get locked away and sit down and prepare. So I got up I took that devotional message and I worked on it some through Saturday. I came in at the crack of dawn Sunday morning, 5:30, 6 o'clock, and really worked to develop it to be able to declare it last Sunday. Now, watch this. If I had not done that, if I had not preached that message, what if I'd preached that message in May? Would it have still been an effective message? Probably. What if the message I'm preaching today I'd preached last week like I had planned to in the first place? Could it have been an effective message? Well, God's word never returns void, right? And would anybody have known the difference? No. Save one, I would have. Because in the back of my mind, kind of eating at me, I learned years and years ago, and this, by the way, this is a practice you just have to learn. I learned when there's an impression by the Holy Spirit like that, don't just deny it. Don't ignore it. Don't ignore Him. And so if I had not preached the message on baptism last week, would Miss Margie have responded? Possibly not. And if she hadn't responded, would the other ladies not have responded? Possibly not. And because these four ladies responded, I'm wondering how many people are sitting here today who are also going to obey God because they said, you know what, these ladies who set their pride aside, who have been in this church for years and who may have very well been risking embarrassment to come forward and say, you know what, I've been here years and years and years, but I need to obey God. I don't care what other people think now. How many sitting out here today might actually obey God in some area or some issue you wouldn't otherwise because you say, you know what, if they risk that embarrassment, then who cares what I'm risking? And would any of that have happened if I had not simply said, okay, Lord, I'm going to step out of the series, I'm going to preach this message? Would it have happened? Maybe. Or maybe not. But how many of you know that we do not live mutually exclusive from one another? And when you obey God, it is very likely that that obedience could affect others. On October 24th, 1929, it's known as Black Thursday. Stock market crashed that day, the great crash. It's a funny thing. That morning, the ticker tape, that little piece of tape that comes out that has all the stock values, right? Of course, now it's all electronic, but in that day it was a literal piece of paper that just tick, 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 all day long, spewing out the stock levels and the amounts and the values. You see, the stock market had been on a decade-long winning streak. It's a funny thing how we are in America. I mean, when we see something on a winning streak, oftentimes if we're not careful, we forget to think, okay, it won't necessarily always be this way. So let's prepare ourselves in case. Now we just truck on. So people were borrowing money to invest in the stock market. And for a long time they had been winning. Now I don't have to tell you what can happen if it crashes. I mean, you're sunk. That morning, the ticker tape had gotten over an hour behind. People began to get antsy, investors, companies, leaders, executives. And so 2 or 3 began to sell. And they were people who other people watched. And because they began to sell, others began to sell. And then others who might not have sold in the first place, they began to sell. And by lunchtime on that particular fateful day, on October the 24th, 1929, 11 well-known stock speculators had actually killed themselves by lunchtime. Companies, individuals lost fortunes that day. The stock market in New York closed early. And of course, the Great Depression began. Most look at that as the beginning of it. What would have happened if, when the ticker tape was late, some of the well-known, well-respected speculators and stockbrokers just held steady and didn't sell? What would have happened? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it could have been that day would pass and it would just be a footnote in history, and it wouldn't have been a crash because people wouldn't be following what others were doing. I don't know, but I know this. Our actions, right and wrong, could affect other people, right and wrong. And it's true in giving. Failure to follow through can discourage giving. And then verse 5. Paul says this, "Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand." You see, before I get there, before I bring my team in, I send a couple of guys ahead. They're going to go among you. They're going to help prepare the offering. So when we arrive, it's all ready. And what you desire to do will actually have been followed through on, so they'll see what you said. And that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. I don't want to show up and say, okay, folks, you said you were going to give. I don't want then you start, oh my goodness, we were supposed to give, and running around because of an obligation. I want you to give because it's just on your heart. You're pouring out with generosity. Generosity will often depend on preparation. Generosity, hear me now, will often depend on preparation. Now, there will be those times and those opportunities where helping someone with your time, helping someone with your resources, helping someone with your talents may catch you by surprise. I got that. But I believe in most cases, generosity is tied a lot to preparing to be generous. Rather than simply the plate's coming, throwing something in the plate out of obligation, I'd almost rather you just wait and pray. Say, Lord, I want to make sure I give what you desire me to, what pleases you, not just throwing something in out of obligation. There was a time years ago when there was a fund drive to raise money for a project that would help children. This is at the beginning to early parts of the 20th century. Henry Ford, the great automaker, pledged $5,000 for the children's project. That next day in the Chicago Tribune, the headlines read, Henry Ford pledges $50,000 toward children's project. Now, Ford was an incredibly wealthy man by then. But he was a tightwad. $50,000 wouldn't have affected him, really. Certainly neither would 5,000. So he contacted the reporter at the Chicago Tribune. He said, "Sir, there's been a mistake. I pledged $5,000, not $50,000. So the editor said, "Mr. Ford, I am so sorry. Tomorrow I'll run a headline, and it will read, 'Ford's pledge for children's project reduced by $45,000. Ford pledged the $50,000. I'm not so sure he gave that willingly. W.A. Criswell, the great pastor of First Baptist, Dallas, Texas, for 40 years, back through the 20th century. First Baptist Dallas was a mega church when there were no mega churches. He had a guy come to him early in his ministry and he said, "Dr. Criswell, I don't make that much money, but I just want to share with you, God's really impressed on me to consistently give 10% of everything I earn." Dr. Criswell prayed with him and the guy left. And years later, 10, 15 years later, the guy comes back to him. He said, "Dr. Criswell, I just want you to pray with me. I'm really having trouble. I make 10 times the amount I made when I came to you 10 years ago. And it's just about impossible for me to give 10% because of the amount that I make. Would you just pray with me?" Dr. Criswell said, "Yes, sir, I will pray with you." Bowed their heads. Dr. Criswell said, "Dear Lord, this man is making such a great income that it's very difficult for him to give the 10%. So now, Lord, would you reduce his income so much so that it will then be easier for him to give again?" Generosity depends on preparation. I prepare ahead of time. Prepare ahead of time. You know, generosity can be a motivating factor at Green Acres Baptist Church, folks. Make no mistake about it. I'm as excited as I've ever been. I'm as optimistic as I've ever been about what God's doing in and through this church. But we still have much to be done. And we still have finances necessary to make those things happen. I don't spend loads of time on giving, but I'll say this. There is always a need at Green Acres Baptist Church, and it's never been greater than it is right now. What's the greatest need, Pastor Johnny? What God has us doing right now, whatever that is. And in your heart of hearts, I don't know where God has you, but I would challenge you to consider, Pastor, or consider, Lord, am I giving in such a way that it would motivate others? If my giving motivates others, then based on what I do, based on how I respond in giving, how much would it really motivate? Our motivation, our motive is critical, isn't it? Bob Kuechenberg, who played with the 1970s Miami Dolphins teams, he was talking with Newsweek one day, and Newsweek asked him how he ended up going to college and then ended up actually playing NFL football. And he said, "My father and my grandfather were human cannonballs." I mean, literally, at the fair, they were human cannonballs and in carnivals. And my father came to me one day and he said, "Bob, you can go to college or you can be a cannonball." A few days later, my grandfather was shot out of a cannon, missed the net, and hit the Ferris wheel. I decided to go to college. It's amazing how the actions of one or more can motivate others, right? The motivating power of generosity. Maybe the giving you need to do that might actually motivate others is to give your life to Jesus today. Maybe that's the giving that needs to happen in your life today. To give your life away to Jesus. Could it be that there are other people sitting in the pew and are very hesitant, very uncertain, and it would take one person coming forward and saying, "Lord, I want to give my life to you. It is time." And who knows if that couldn't unleash a stream of people. Maybe it is, listen family, maybe it is that it's time for you to give of yourself to the ministry of Green Acres Baptist Church, meaning this, "Pastor Johnny, I think it's time for me to come and be a part of Green Acres Baptist Church and join." And when you join Green Acres Baptist Church, you're saying, "I'm giving of myself to be a part of what God's doing in this church body." And maybe that's the giving you're to do today. Maybe your giving is financial. Maybe your giving is ministry. You know as well as I do, there's never a lack of opportunities to serve. And maybe it's time you step up and step out and say, I'm not sure where I can give of myself, but I want to be a part of what Green Acres is doing. I want to give myself into ministry. I've been sitting on a pew long enough. And maybe your giving might motivate someone else, might motivate 2 others, 10 others, 20 others. But you don't concern yourself with that. All you need to do is say, Lord, how am I to give? And respond. And who knows what kind of impact it would have today. Pray with me. Father, right now, help us to respond to your call in our lives. We ask in Jesus' name.